happens when a single intersection becomes a mirror of America's identity crisis. The morning heat on Figueroa shimmered like a blade. Unmarked SUVs glided between sun-bleached palms, their engines barely louder than the hum of the city. To passers-by, it looked like another day in Los Angeles. To the agents inside, it was the moment between control and collapse. On the radio, target car located, box in on my mark, then silence. A gray sedan twitched forward, steel meeting steel. The trap snapped shut, and within seconds, routine turned into riot. The vehicle pinned between 4 federal units was more than a suspect, it was the latest collision between Washington's hardened border policy and California's defiant sanctuary stance. President Donald Trump's renewed Homeland Enforcement directive had granted agencies like ICE and the U.S. Marshals expanded powers under what officials called Operation Border Continuum. The aim cracked down on undocumented fugitives using urban precision raids. The result, a city once proud of its diversity, now frozen in disbelief as a federal operation ignited live on every phone screen. According to Reuters and BBC correspondents on the ground, the agents followed standard box-in procedure until the suspect rammed one vehicle in reverse. Shots followed one agent, wounded, one suspect bleeding. Within minutes, the world was watching a street corner transform into a battleground over American law itself. Strategically, this was more than enforcement, it was deterrence. DHS officials argued that such visible actions project federal resolve across cities resisting cooperation. Defense News compared the coordination of these raids to tactical counter-mobility operations used in hybrid war zones like Ukraine, swift encirclement, controlled engagement, and immediate extraction. Yet as DW analysts noted, every bullet fired in Los Angeles rippled through diplomatic screens from Brussels to Mexico City. The incident became an emblem of how domestic enforcement shapes international image. The parallels stretched further. In Ukraine, precision strikes defined territorial control. In Israel's operations against Iran's proxies, civilian zones become political weapons. And in the tense South China Sea, US-China maritime patrols mirror the same logic control. The perimeter claimed legitimacy defined power through motion. America's streets, once safe symbols of democracy, now mirrored its global frontiers, blurred, contested, patrolled. But behind the steel and policy were people, nurses watching from hospital windows, children filming through glass, a marshal staring at his bloodied hand. The human cost was not in lives lost, but in trust eroded. Each frame uploaded carried a question larger than any operation plan: how much security is too much when freedom itself begins to flinch? And as Los Angeles exhaled under its endless sun, one question remained: how many more intersections must burn before America finds the line between protection and power? The street was still trembling when the first live streams hit the internet. 10 seconds of footage, sirens, shouts, a flash of smoke turned into 10 million arguments. Federal overreach, some cried. Criminal resistance, others answered. The truth lay bleeding in between. The sedan was riddled with bullet holes. The front of an icy SUV was caved in. Both the driver and a marshal were down but alive. Within an hour, Figueroa raid trended across every platform, and Los Angeles became the newest front line in a war of narratives. Reuters confirmed that the operation was part of a larger federal surge ordered from Washington under the president's renewed urban integrity directive. Over 40 coordinated box-ins were planned across California, Texas, and Arizona, aimed at dismantling networks allegedly shielding illegal entries from Mexico. To the Department of Homeland Security, it was a crackdown long overdue. To local leaders, it was an invasion in plain clothes. The escalation was immediate. Protesters surged toward County USC Hospital, where both wounded men were taken. One carried a flag upside down, a signal of distress. Another live-streamed his arrest to 1,000 viewers chanting his handle. Police scanners filled with noise, crowd forming at the East Wing, barricades needed media en route. The hospital became a fortress, the city a stage. Strategically, this wasn't just about one suspect. It was a test of federal resolve against state defiance. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly compared the tension to hybrid standoffs in Eastern Europe, where state and non-state actors compete for legitimacy within the same borders. In Los Angeles, the battlefield was legal, not territorial, but the tactics were eerily familiar: rapid response propaganda, disinformation escalation. And like in global theaters, Ukraine's contested Donbass Israel's blockaded borders and the South China Sea's disputed islands, information itself was the weapon. DW reported that within 2 hours, 3 fabricated videos claiming mass arrests of citizens had circulated online, traced to servers outside the US. Cyber analysts warned that both foreign and domestic groups were exploiting the chaos to deepen division, proof that America's internal storms no longer stayed internal. The strategic question, as Al Jazeera framed it, was this: how does a superpower project authority abroad when its streets burn with unresolved conflicts at home? Trump's administration defended the raids as restoring federal dignity, a phrase echoing through press rooms from Washington to Warsaw. European diplomats, however, quietly told The Guardian they feared the optics a democratic nation deploying paramilitary tactics in civilian zones could erode America's moral high ground. In homes around Figueroa, residents stayed indoors, blinds drawn. Some whispered that the city was splitting federal versus local law versus rights order versus freedom. Every city has a moment when it must choose what it stands for. For Los Angeles, that moment came under a noon sun, where asphalt shimmered and trust cracked. Now, as the footage kept replaying and the narratives kept mutating, the question grew louder: was this the price of safety or the symptom of something far deeper unraveling inside the world's most powerful democracy? By afternoon, the battle had moved from the street to the sterile corridors of County USC Medical Center. 2 gurneys arrived almost simultaneously, one carrying a U.S. Marshal with a shattered hand, the other a bleeding suspect with a torn elbow. They were rolled into separate wings, divided by a hallway, but joined by the same chaos that had erupted on Figueroa. Outside, the air was electric with chant sirens and the hum of hundreds of cameras. "Hands off our city" echoed against "protect our borders." Protesters and counter-protesters clashed near the ambulance bay, each side convinced they were defending America. DW described it as a battlefield without bullets, but with the same fever. Inside, doctors tried to maintain order as a tide of noise seeped through the hospital glass. A nurse whispered, "It feels like we're treating the country, not just the patients." Reuters reported that the Department of Homeland Security and the Los Angeles mayor's office immediately issued dueling statements. DHS called it a targeted enforcement action gone violent, while City Hall accused federal agents of reckless endangerment. Within hours, journalists from BBC and Al Jazeera arrived broadcasting live from the hospital steps as if it were a war zone. Strategically, the hospital scene embodied America's fault line, the collision between security enforcement and civic resistance. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted that federal agents are now trained using doctrines once reserved for urban counterinsurgency tight formations, vehicle containment, psychological dominance. What was once a foreign playbook used in Iraq or Donetsk had become standard practice on U.S. soil. Globally, parallels surfaced fast. In Ukraine, civilian hospitals had become sanctuaries and symbols in the war's moral theater. In Gaza, Israel's military operations often ended at the doorsteps of emergency wards filled with victims and accusations. In both, truth was contested territory. And in Los Angeles, the same dynamic unfolded: facts blurred by emotion, law clouded by outrage, morality fractured under flashing lights. From Beijing to Moscow, state media seized on the event. The Guardian cited official Chinese commentary labeling the incident proof of American instability. Kremlin-linked outlets echoed that message, portraying U.S. domestic enforcement as occupation of its own citizens. It was propaganda with a purpose to erode America's image as the world's stable democracy, especially as President Trump's renewed immigration policy became a headline abroad. The human cost, though, defied politics. The marshal, identified by BBC sources only as Agent Rhodes, was expected to recover. The suspect, a 28-year-old Honduran national, faced charges under federal immigration statutes but remained under sedation. Between them stood a nurse who quietly taped gauze a surgeon who refused interviews and a janitor who swept glass from the hall. The crisis had turned strangers into symbols, each representing something bigger, harder, and far less merciful than themselves. As the sun set over Los Angeles, the chants outside merged into a single question that even the hospital walls couldn't block: if every act of protection creates new fear, who truly feels safe anymore? By nightfall, the conflict left the hospital and stormed into the nation's microphones. 2 podiums, 2 Americas. In Washington, DHS spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin faced the press under the seal of the Eagle. These are the consequences, she declared, of encouraging people to resist lawful arrest. Our officers face a 1,000% rise in assaults. This is not a political stunt, this is survival. Her words echoed across screens from Fox News to Reuters, framing the Figueroa confrontation as part of a larger war for law and order. Meanwhile, at Los Angeles City Hall, the mayor stood beneath a banner reading "Community First." Her voice was measured, surgical. "We will not tolerate unlawful detentions of residents, citizens, or otherwise." Behind her, council members looked hollow-eyed, their exhaustion broadcast in high definition. To one side of the screen, Washington demanded obedience. To the other, Los Angeles demanded accountability. BBC and The Guardian both reported the next morning that the clash between federal and local leadership had escalated into open political warfare. City attorneys prepared lawsuits alleging civil rights violations, while DHS doubled down invoking federal supremacy clauses. To many Americans, it looked less like law enforcement and more like civil disobedience in uniform. Strategically, the event became a textbook example of internal fragmentation, a phenomenon studied by NATO analysts who normally apply it to fragile states abroad. DW compared it to the post-Maidan years in Ukraine, where competing layers of government undermined one another's legitimacy, while adversaries abroad watched and waited. Here the enemy wasn't external, it was systemic disunity widening before the world's eyes. From Israel to Iran, officials studied the American standoff with keen interest. Al Jazeera noted that Iran's Revolutionary Guard media outlets mocked the disunited empire, calling the raid evidence of imperial decline. Israeli analysts, however, warned that internal fractures in U.S. governance could embolden adversaries across the Middle East, eroding deterrence credibility, a direct concern for Jerusalem as it prepared for renewed Hezbollah skirmishes on its northern border. Even Beijing noticed. Chinese foreign policy journals described the Figueroa standoff as a symptom of democratic overextension, a message aimed squarely at the Pacific stage where American naval patrols in the South China Sea continue to challenge China's sovereignty claims. As one DW analyst wrote, "A nation divided at home speaks with less force abroad." Back in Los Angeles, the city became theater. Federal convoys moved through backstreets, while protesters waved banners reading "No kings, no cages." Helicopters hovered overhead, their lights sweeping through fog like search beams over a restless conscience. The clash wasn't about one arrest anymore, it was about identity power and the invisible thread holding a superpower together. And in the midst of the noise, a quiet question lingered: if every speech, every operation, and every broadcast deepens the divide, who still believes that America's unity can outlast its anger? While the headlines screamed, the real struggle unfolded in silence inside command posts, courtrooms, and encrypted conference calls. Across downtown Los Angeles, a DHS coordination hub pulsed with digital light. Maps of the city glowed with shifting icons, field units, shelters, hospitals, protest clusters. A whiteboard displayed one phrase in bold markers: Supreme Court clearance operational until challenge. It referred to the court's recent ruling upholding the federal government's right to conduct targeted immigration raids even in self-declared sanctuary zones. The decision split the nation. In practice, it opened the gates. Defense News reported that the operation's structure resembled a distributed enforcement model mirroring modern battlefield doctrine: modular teams, data synchronization, predictive mapping. Analysts drew parallels to drone warfare in Ukraine and counterinsurgency mapping in Syria. Law enforcement had entered a new era: precision policing powered by artificial intelligence and sanctioned by federal law. But what happens when tactical perfection collides with moral imperfection? Inside one of those courtrooms, federal lawyers defended the mission as a lawful execution of executive authority. City attorneys countered that it was a violation of municipal sovereignty. The arguments weren't about one suspect or one raid, they were about who truly commands America's streets. The Guardian called it a constitutional tug-of-war disguised as crime control. Meanwhile, intelligence briefings leaked to Reuters revealed that foreign disinformation networks linked to Russia, Iran, and China had amplified social media narratives around the Figueroa incident, pushing hashtags like "state occupation" and "federal siege." It was hybrid warfare without missiles, digital chaos designed to make citizens question their own government. NATO cyber divisions, citing the same trend in Europe, labeled it psychological infiltration at civic scale. Globally, the symmetry was striking. In Ukraine, Russia blurred the line between law enforcement and war-branding invasions as special operations. In Iran, security crackdowns were justified as moral defense. In China, dissent was criminalized as disorder. Now America's own actions filmed on Figueroa risked echoing those same optics. DW's Berlin Bureau wrote, "The United States now wages an internal struggle over the meaning of its democracy, watched by every rival who benefits from the spectacle." Inside the command post, an officer rubbed his temples beneath flickering fluorescent light. "We're doing our jobs," he muttered, but every move feels like proof of someone's argument. The tension between mission and meaning had never felt sharper. By dusk, the maps were reset. New targets appeared along the I-10 corridor. The machine of enforcement rolled on indifferent to the noise outside. But beyond the data points and legal briefs, the moral geometry remained broken. How does a nation enforce its borders without building them around itself? How long can law chase order before freedom gets caught in the crossfire? Dawn broke over Los Angeles with a deceptive calm. Fog rolled down from the hills, softening the city's edges, hiding last night's scars beneath a pale light. But beneath the quiet engine stirred. The same unmarked SUVs that boxed in a sedan on Figueroa now idled behind another strip mall, different target, same choreography. Target car located, came the voice over the radio. Box in on my mark. The ritual continued. The cycle of enforcement and outrage had become as predictable as the sunrise. Reuters confirmed that despite public criticism, federal raids under the Urban Integrity Directive had expanded into new sectors, transport hubs, logistics warehouses, even hospitals suspected of harboring undocumented workers. The Trump administration framed it as non-negotiable federal continuity, reinforcing America's authority against what officials called municipal defiance. Yet to many Americans, it felt less like protection and more like an unending occupation of familiar streets. Across the Pacific, The Guardian reported Chinese commentators seized on the footage as evidence that the American empire turns its surveillance inward. Russian analysts mocked the collapse of Western liberalism. Even allies like Germany voiced concern. A DW editorial asked, if Washington polices Los Angeles like a war zone, what message does it send to Kyiv or Taipei about the future of freedom? At home, the question was simpler and crueler. Where does safety end and suppression begin? ICE units now operated under reinforced legal immunity, while federal-local coordination eroded further. Inside DHS command briefings, officials spoke in cold arithmetic number of raids, number of arrests, projected deterrence impact, yet each statistic represented a human fracture. Families split, neighborhoods silenced, trusts dismantled. In this atmosphere, parallels to global conflicts felt hauntingly close. In Ukraine, drones hovered over cities. In Los Angeles, surveillance towers watched intersections. In Israel and Iran, proxy strikes justified as preemptive defense mirrored America's domestic justification for preemptive containment. Even the South China Sea echoed here, disputed zones, blurred lines of authority, rival forces circling for dominance. The difference was geography, not philosophy. A federal agent, his hand still bandaged from the Figueroa clash, stared through the windshield at Dawn's faint reflection. The radio crackled again. Code words coordinate silence. Around him, the team moved like a practiced machine, the rhythm of duty louder than the questions that followed it. The convoy rolled forward, tires whispering against wet asphalt. Somewhere in the city, another door would open, another life would change, another headline would be born. As the fog lifted, Los Angeles revealed its bruises, taped windows, darkened storefronts, graffiti that read, "Who protects the protected?" The city looked both exhausted and defiant, as if daring Washington to blink first. And so the question remained floating above the skyline and echoing through the canyons of concrete and memory. How long can a nation claim to lead the world in freedom while learning to fear the sound of its own sirens? The Figueroa operation began as a routine immigration box-in, but exploded into a national reckoning. Federal agents cornered a suspect, shots were fired, chaos followed. The clash between President Trump's Homeland Enforcement Directive and Los Angeles' sanctuary resistance ignited protests, political outrage, and international scrutiny. Across hospitals and newsrooms, the event became a symbol of America's internal conflict between law and liberty. Globally, the incident mirrored patterns seen in Ukraine, Israel, and China, power asserting order under the banner of protection. Defense analysts noted that America's domestic tactics increasingly resembled military precision, while foreign adversaries exploited the optics to weaken U.S. moral authority. Amid maps, data, and policy, the human cost was quietly devastating. Trust. Shattered communities, divided democracy tested. As convoys rolled again through fog-bound streets, the question endured, can a superpower secure its borders without losing the soul that once defined its